Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States of America, William Jefferson Clinton.
On a crisp January morning in 1993, Bill Clinton took the oath of office as the 42nd President of the United States. Promising a new start, he sounded the themes of change and optimism that had won him the White House.
Our democracy must be not only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America.
He did have heroic visions of what he might do as president. He felt that the winds of change were blowing heavily at his back and that he could ride them to great, magnificent victories. The harder reality was that he only won with 43% of the vote in a three-man race. And that's not exactly a heady mandate for governing.
Clinton's victory had come despite a deep divide in the country. Millions had responded to his campaign message of change, but millions of others feared where the country was heading and did not trust their inexperienced new president to lead them through uncertain times.
There was a group of people who had a visceral dislike for Bill Clinton. They felt that he had stayed just one step ahead of the posse with his personal problems. They thought that he represented a 1960s generation that was always trying to pull a fast one and not playing by traditional rules. They despised him and thought there was something illegitimate about his presidency.
This is a sense of him being a used car salesman. This is a sense of a guy being a charming hick. He was loathed because, first place, I think we've all known somebody like Bill Clinton, and we don't want them to be president of our country.
Ms. Clinton?
And the wife was terrifying as well. She was pushy, she was humorless, she couldn't get her hair figured out. There were just so many things about Hillary that we didn't like.
Despite all their education and experience, the Clintons were unprepared for their reception in Washington.
He still labored under the assumption that he could bring people together through power of persuasion. It was stunning to him that Republicans would just very blatantly tell him, we're not here to cooperate with you, and this is going to be open warfare from the very beginning.
It's a big leap from the state capitol to the nation's capital and to the world's capital. And the Clintons found that Washington was a shock for them. The rules were very different. People weren't as friendly. People had other agendas. A lot of knives were out. People played behind curtains. You just never knew what was going to come out and strike you.
90 seconds. Is there a teleprompter? What are we going to do about the teleprompter?
He had no comprehension of the rules of the road in Washington. No governor ever elected to the presidency has ever understood what they were getting into. And he looked more unprepared than most.
Well, wait a minute. How long are you going to have to wait?
His first address from the Oval Office, sitting behind the desk, it looked like a big mistake had happened. And some little kid had been allowed in there with his $12 digital watch. Everything about him suggested he was not up to this.
Clinton ran his White House as if it were an extension of the campaign. filling his staff with 30-year-olds with little Washington experience. He wanted to be part of the hurly-burly, to hear every opinion, weigh in on every decision.
The atmosphere in the White House in that first year was chaos. He wanted to do everything. He wanted to deal with every problem. He was in the middle of every conflict.
They would have these college bowl sessions. It would go on, late into the night.
The meetings were endless, especially if Clinton was in the meeting. It would go on and on and on.
He was often thinking out loud, making decisions on the fly, making a decision tentatively at midnight, and then waking up the next morning and saying, let's rethink this.
The West Wing was littered with pizza boxes and Coke cans as staffers wandered freely in and out of meetings.
It wasn't the kind of orderly process that Republicans brought to the table. It was all these discordant voices, informal voices, people who didn't even wear ties and jackets when they went into the Oval Office. My God.
You got to be a little grand because the American people want it. It's the biggest job in the world. And I think we underestimated that. People felt like, what is it, a fraternity house over there?
As Clinton took office in the winter of 1993, the economic crisis that had propelled him into office showed few signs of abating.
We had had a recession, we had high unemployment, and there was a lot of uncertainty about whether the United States was going to get on its feet again, or whether we could be in for a long period of real difficulty. So he came into a very difficult environment.
During the transition, Clinton had promised to focus on the economy like a laser beam. But he quickly discovered how easily his focus could be deflected by an unscripted comment to a reporter.
Do you intend to keep your commitment to lift the ban on gays in the military?
Yes. I want to, you know what my issue on this is? Number one, we've got a study which says that a lot of gays have performed with great distinction in the military. I don't think status alone, in the absence of some destructive behavior, should disqualify people.
Now, Bill Clinton, with his wits about him, would have said, oh, yes, I'm going to stick to my campaign pledge, and in furtherance of that, we're going to appoint a blue ribbon commission that will report back to my successor 100 years from now. But he didn't. He just said the first part, I'm going to keep my campaign pledge. And all of a sudden, the laser-like focus on the economy was derailed to a lurid issue in the minds of many people.
Mr. President, would you consider backing down on the ban on gays in the military?
We're not here to discuss that. We're here to discuss the economy, which is all I discussed yesterday with congressional leadership, contrary to the press report.
But would you consider...
We're here to discuss the economy.
Trapped by his own promise, Clinton attempted to lift the ban, but ran into heavy resistance from two allies, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Colin Powell and Democratic Senator Sam Nunn.
So you have the military leadership bucking him, Democratic congressional leaders, led by, Chairman of the Armed Services Committee saying no, and the president is powerless to do anything about it. And so he's now put into a position where he has to try to negotiate some kind of a resolution to this that will save face.
Therefore, the practice, now 6 months old...
After weeks of fruitless wrangling, Clinton announced a compromise, don't ask, don't tell, that few could even understand.
An open statement by a service member that he or she is a homosexual will create a rebuttable presumption that he or she intends to engage in prohibited conduct. But the service member will be given an opportunity to refute that presumption.
Nobody was particularly happy with don't ask, don't tell. But it was the best that you could do to get it off the table so you could move on.
Other capitulations quickly followed. He dropped a stimulus bill and campaign finance reform in the face of congressional opposition.
It became very apparent very soon that Bill Clinton as president was not going to be an LBJ. He was not going to assert his authority, make deals, crack heads, push his weight around. say to any members of Congress in the leadership that if you don't follow me, you're going to pay for this because I'm going to remember it. You're not going to get this. You're not going to get that. You know, LBJ knew how to use power. Bill Clinton knew much of that, but he also wanted to be liked.
You swear the testimony you're about to...
When Attorney General nominee Zoe Baird got into hot water over her failure to pay taxes for household help, Clinton hardly put up a fight.
The first day I was in the White House, the president said to me, "We're having problems with Zoe Baird."
To me, this is a big deal, personally, and I suspect it is to a lot of Americans. But
He says, "I'm hearing from Democratic senators that it's going to really be a problem, and the press is on my back." My position was, look, you already nominated her. She's an excellent person. We should stick with Zoe Baird. And he decided no.
I feel very badly about it, but I'm responsible for it, and I'm going to start this afternoon looking for an attorney general.
In order to placate the opposing parties' criticisms and media criticisms, which began at day one, the Clinton administration kept folding, kept giving in. I think that undermined his presidency. It showed he could be rolled.
The media, which had embraced Clinton during the campaign, now began to turn on him. When his nomination of Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Supreme Court took a tortuous course, reporters pounced.
Your turn, late it seems, to Judge Ginsburg may have created an impression, perhaps unfair, of a certain zigzag quality in the decision-making process here. I wonder, sir, if you could kind of walk us through it, perhaps disabuse us of any notion you might have along those lines. Thank you.
I have long since given up the thought that I could disabuse some of you of turning any substantive decision into anything but political process. How you could ask a question like that after the statement she just made is beyond me.
What he wanted people to do, just look at the result. Did I make a good decision or not? But as president, every decision that Bill Clinton makes, and not just the decisions, but how he makes these decisions, is receiving merciless scrutiny. The messiness of the process became part of the story, and Bill Clinton found it maddening.
The Clintons arrived in Washington in the midst of a media revolution. The advent of cable television and the 24-hour news cycle created an insatiable appetite for colorful coverage of Washington.
Cable television was beginning to become a force. And the competition among cable news became a vicious fact of Bill Clinton's life. Sex sold. Corruption sold.
Throughout the spring of 1993, a series of scandals, including Travelgate and Hairgate, flared in the press. Hillary found it hard to shrug off the negative press. Stories, like the one alleging that she broke a lamp during a heated argument with the president, embarrassed and humiliated her. "I've always believed in a zone of privacy," she said, "but I guess I've been rezoned."
She had an agenda, changes in the country, in the world that she wanted to see done. She couldn't understand why the media was focusing constantly on their private life, but the more she fought it, the more she drew attention to it.
The lawyer chosen to lead the Clintons' defense was their close friend and deputy White House counsel, Vince Foster.
Vince, he got very upset with the attacks. He felt we couldn't stop these attacks. Yes, no, we couldn't stop these attacks. You know, this is the nature of the game down here. This is the partisan game down here. And I kept trying to calm him down. But I did see him getting sadder and sadder. And then that day came when he took his own life.
On the afternoon of July 20th, Vince Foster told an assistant that he was going out for a few minutes. That evening, his body was found in a secluded park 10 miles from the White House, a bullet hole through his head. A torn-up note was found a few days later at the bottom of Foster's briefcase. "I was not meant for the job or the spotlight of public life in Washington," it read. "Here, ruining people is considered sport."
I was very concerned that, knowing how close Vince Foster was to both Bill and Hillary, that it would be sort of the final straw for Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton in Washington. They would just think, this town's impossible. You know, we've lost one of our best friends. He's taken his life in the midst of this melee. And that something very intangible would be lost. Bill Clinton's one of the most resilient people I've ever met. The pain goes deeper with Hillary, and it can stay there longer. She's strong, but she's also vulnerable.
Far from destroying the Clintons, Foster's death steeled them against their adversaries. For Hillary, there could be no more illusions. This would be a war with only one winner.
They were toughening up by this time. They were seeing now that, yeah, we're in a blood sport. That people are trying to kill you, and nothing is going to make them happy.
Foster's suicide only fueled the media's fascination with scandal. Within days of the discovery of his body, there was speculation about the real cause of his death.
The immediate reaction to Vince Foster's death was, what happened here, and were the Clintons involved? Were they covering something up? There begins bubbling up this notion that there's a conspiracy, that Vince Foster has been murdered, you know, on one account, his body rolled up in a rug, he's having an affair with Hillary, all of these terrible things.
Attention focused mostly on some files mysteriously removed from Foster's office after his death, including documents related to an old Arkansas land deal, Whitewater. Whitewater, the scandal that would haunt Clinton's presidency longer than any other, had its roots in the late 1970s. At the time, Bill Clinton was a young attorney general, making just over $25,000 a year. Hillary, an associate at the Rose law firm in Little Rock, was the family's main breadwinner. When an old friend named Jim McDougal approached her with a plan to build vacation homes along the White River, Hillary decided to invest.
Here's a guy, McDougal, that comes to him and says, put a little money into this thing, and said, boy, you'll be rich and you'll make money and this is going to be great. Well, I guess in hindsight, every person promoting any sort of land scheme thinks it's going to be a world beater and we're going to be rich as Midas by the time it's over.
Like many of McDougal's real estate projects, Whitewater went belly up. To prop up his scheme, he made illegal transfers from his own savings and loan, Madison Guarantee. McDougal was charged with fraud.
President Clinton, you just mentioned James McDougal, your former business partner. A lot of questions have been raised about his business practices.
15 years later, President Clinton was asked by reporters what he and Hillary knew about McDougal's illegal activities.
To the best of my knowledge, he was honest in his dealings with me, and that's all I can comment on. You know, in my
The White House was totally unprepared for it. There was no memo on it. There was no defense group.
I had nothing to do with the management of Whitewater, that Hillary had nothing to do with it. We didn't keep the books or the records.
There were some of us who said, keep the walls up, keep it back, you know, it's none of their business. Nothing happened. It's a little deal down in Arkansas, has nothing to do with the presidency, and it'll go away. It didn't go away, but that built up a suspicion, and as new things leaked out, as inconsequential as they might be, the press would say, oh, the Clintons have been hiding stuff. And there was built up relatively quickly that the Clintons were just stonewalling.
The emergence of the Whitewater scandal couldn't have come at a worse time for President Clinton. In the late summer of 1993, he needed broad political support as his first major piece of legislation, the federal budget, was headed for a showdown in Congress.
We knew that if Bill Clinton lost that vote, the signal would be he can't get the Democrats in the House and the Senate to go along with him. That means he doesn't have power. That's the definition of lacking power. And if this early in the administration, our new president lacks power, where do we go next?
Abandoning his campaign promise to cut taxes and invest in the middle class, Clinton instead took the advice of the administration's deficit hawks to reduce spending and raise taxes.
Bill Clinton's first big decision was an intellectual act of faith.
We're on the eve of historic action. Without deficit reduction, we can't have sustained economic growth.
He gambled in the midst of a recession that he'd get more economic growth if he was fiscally conservative and if he began to reduce the deficit. That would convince the bond market to start reducing interest rates and the economy would grow. That was just a theory. No one knew it would work.
More than anything, Clinton had wanted to invest in the middle class. The realization that he couldn't left him deeply disappointed.
He didn't become president to say no. He didn't become president to administer pain. He didn't become president because he wanted to placate Wall Street. But in fact, his agenda did require, to some extent, doing all those things.
As the budget reached Congress, Clinton knew it was on a knife edge. With Republicans unanimously opposed, the president needed nearly every Democratic vote to pass the bill. But the party, like the administration, was in disarray. Liberal Democrats complained about the cuts in spending, while conservatives opposed the tax hikes.
I think that the president will fail, the party will fail, and the country will fail if we enact this budget.
Faced with the possibility of a catastrophic defeat, Clinton got down to work. I knew if I didn't get the economy going, he said, nothing else would matter.
There wasn't anything he wasn't willing to do. He would call, he would meet, he would grovel, he would strong arm, he would use every tactic any leader has at his disposal to try to get this thing done.
But the days when a president could command votes, even from members of his own party, were long over.
Bill Clinton was used to Arkansas. You know, he knew the good old boys. He knew who he had to go to. He could walk on the floor of the legislature and basically, you know, with a smile and a pat in the back, he could get any vote he wanted. That wasn't true here in Washington. And in many ways, it was frustrating for him because he really felt that he knew what was best for the country and that by the sheer power of his personality and his words and his smile, that somehow he can make it work.
The budget wended its way through a series of committee and floor votes in the House and Senate.
We went into some of these votes not having the votes, getting calls during the voting process that, you know, someone had turned, someone had moved. You know, these things are being won by one vote. I mean, imagine that. I mean, this is the budget. This is like his entire presidency goes down if he fails. And, you know, you're up, you know, to one vote on, you know, each time.
In early August, the final budget bill reached the floor of the House. With the vote still in doubt, all eyes turned to a freshman Democrat from an historically Republican district, Marjorie Margulies Mezvinsky.
We had her down as voting yes, and she votes no early on. And so we said, go in there, find out what the hell's going on, try to turn her vote around. First of all, I mean, as a former member, if you're going to vote against the leadership, vote and get the hell out of there. She didn't do that. She stayed there. So suddenly these guys are all pouring on her, and she's standing there, and they're saying, come on, you got to change your vote. This is important to the administration. She then says something like, I'll do this, but the president has to come into my district. So they call me back in the office and they say, will the president come into her district to do so? And I said, absolutely. Whatever it takes, we're going to do it.
With the vote and his presidency on the line, Clinton paced nervously in a small office in the West Wing.
We're all crowded around this little television set, really with quite a high level of uncertainty.
Finally, Mezvinsky cast her vote yes, and the budget passed. With an equally narrow victory in the Senate, Clinton's final budget became law. Not even he foresaw the economic boom it would set off.
It contributed enormously to what turned out to be the longest economic expansion in the nation's history. 22 million new jobs were created, productivity went up, incomes rose at all levels, and for the first time in 30 years, we had a federal surplus.
By the fall of 1993, there were glimmers of a turnaround in Clinton's fortunes. After passing his budget, Congress approved the North American Free Trade Agreement with overwhelming Republican support. The same month, he signed the Brady Bill, instituting background checks for anyone purchasing a firearm. NAFTA and Brady culminated 10 months of intense focus on domestic affairs. But beyond America's shores, a troubled world would wait no longer for the president's attention.
The Cold War had kept a lot of tensions quiet and a lot of groups quiet. And now, with that over, all of the old animosities, all of the old hatreds, ethnic hatreds, regional tensions that had been under that iceberg of the Cold War were now popping out and were real problems.
How much did the United States want to get involved in problems in the rest of the world, which tended to be localized problems? Were those worthy of our time and attention? This was uncharted territory.
We were all reaching for, all searching for some new grand unifying theory. Give us a new way of looking at the world.
Clinton had little to offer in the realm of foreign affairs. The first president since World War II who had not worn a military uniform, he lacked confidence as a commander-in-chief.
Clinton came to the White House with very little knowledge of the U.S. military. Famously, he didn't even know how to salute. To a great many people in this country, that was legitimately something to be worried about.
Clinton's first major foreign policy crisis came in the African nation of Somalia, where a warlord named Mohammed Farah Aidid was terrorizing the local population in an effort to suppress his opponents in a civil war. Clinton inserted U.S. Special Forces into Somalia to capture Aidid. During a mission on October 3rd, 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. American forces sent in to assist were pinned down by overwhelming firepower. Before they could be extracted, 18 U.S. soldiers were killed, with 84 more wounded. Around the world, images of a dead American soldier being dragged through the streets inflamed public opinion.
Although George H.W. Bush had initiated that intervention, it had expanded on Bill Clinton's watch. So when things turned bad, it was hugely unpopular, and Bill Clinton bore the brunt of that.
You need to understand the average citizen. In their minds, we have gone there on a humanitarian mission to offer a helping hand, and we get attacked and humiliated. Why are we there? Why should we continue to help? Why are you keeping the boys there? Bring the boys home. That sort of political pressure that President Clinton and his team had to deal with.
The backlash in public opinion contained what seemed a clear lesson for the young president. Military intervention, without a compelling national interest, came with unforeseeable risks and costs.
It sent a chill through the administration and made them much more reluctant to intervene in other parts of the world. And where that came home in the most profound way, and one that Bill Clinton came to deeply, deeply regret, was in Rwanda.
Rwanda, an African nation 1,000 miles to the west of Somalia, was suffering through its own civil war between two tribes, Hutus and Tutsis. In early April 1994, the Rwandan president's plane was shot down. The Hutu government blamed Tutsi rebels.
When the plane was shot down, all hell broke loose, and that became the trigger which set off this mass killing.
The killing caught the Clinton administration entirely by surprise.
That night I was leaving the office, and I noticed on CNN on the television screen there was shooting going on. And I said to my assistant, "What's going on? What is that?" He said, "Oh, it's Rwanda. There's some kind of operation going on over there." I said, "Is that real? Is that on time?" He said, "Yes, sir."
Ultimately, some 800,000 Tutsis would be killed. But with the Black Hawk Down incident still fresh, the Clinton administration did virtually nothing to stop the slaughter.
We needed international support in Rwanda, but the will to intervene was not there. They knew what was happening, but they were not about to take the risks. Rwanda lived in the shadow of Somalia and paid the price for what had happened in Somalia.
Clinton's foreign policy was trapped in a kind of no man's land. If Somalia had demonstrated the risks of military intervention, Rwanda proved the costs of doing nothing.
I know the president felt awful afterwards, awful, as it came out and we understood the scale, the enormity. We realized that there are sins of omission as well as sins of commission. This was a horrible omission.
Here we go.
All right, flip it, Chelsea.
Battered by a year Hillary described as hellish, the Clintons were looking forward to their first Christmas in Washington. Escaping the White House, they visited close friends and even shopped at a local mall. Bill and Hillary had always been doting parents to Chelsea, trying to keep her life as normal as possible.
Both Hillary and Bill, in their own way, were fabulous parents. Very protective of Chelsea and managed to keep a cordon of privacy around her, let her grow up more or less naturally.
For the most part, the press respected Chelsea's privacy, but showed no such consideration for her parents. In mid-December, the first family's hopes for a quiet Christmas were dashed when a call from the Washington Post once again plunged them into the roiling currents of the Whitewater scandal.
I got a call from Bob Kaiser, who was then the #2 editor at the Washington Post. And he said, "David, you know, we've known each other a long time, and we've made numerous requests to the White House for some Whitewater-related documents that we're getting stonewalled, and we're about to go on the attack."
Many on his staff counseled the president to turn over his private papers on Whitewater to the Post.
I said, "Mr. President, this is a flagship newspaper. They're going to put a team of investigative reporters on this if you don't give these documents over, and no one knows where that's going to go. Why don't we just do it now and just, you know, do the fair and square thing?" He said, "I agree. Let's do it." He said, "But there's one problem." He said, "I'm in this with Hillary. You've got to go convince Hillary."
Hillary's attitude toward the press, and thus towards the Washington Post, was to pull back, to reveal nothing, to keep the media or anybody else who's asked questions about their inside life at bay. So she's locked down.
Finally, after about 2 weeks, I got a call from the counsel's office saying, by the way, David, we have now sent a letter to the Washington Post. Now, we'll read it to you. And I said, fine, let me hear the letter. And basically he said, Dear Washington Post, screw you. No documents.
Clinton's refusal to turn over his private Whitewater records was a red flag to many of his political enemies. In early January, Republican Senator Robert Dole demanded the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate Whitewater.
If there's nothing to hide, why not lay it all out there? But every day there's another little drip coming from somewhere.
Dole's demand reignited the argument inside the White House. Most of Clinton's advisors urged him to appoint a special prosecutor. But Hillary and White House counsel Bernie Nussbaum argued against it.
I said to the president, they'll investigate you. They won't find anything because you did nothing in Whitewater. But they'll investigate you. If somebody did something in Arkansas in the last 20 years, they will try to find that person, then they will try to get that person to save their neck to remember something that you did in Arkansas in the last 20 years, which was illegal. This will last, Mr. President, as long as you're president and beyond.
The contrary argument was, we're trying to run a presidency in a White House here. This is not going to go away. Yes, you can stave it off for a while, but at some point, everything is going to come out.
And that's when Clinton said, I can't take it anymore. Tell me what to do. You got to give me, tell me what to do. He screams at me.
We finally persuaded Hillary, much against her better instincts, to call the president and say that we wanted him to authorize Attorney General Reno to appoint a special counsel.
Exhausted and heartsick over the recent death of his mother, Clinton did not put up a fight. On January 20th, 1994, Attorney General Janet Reno, acting on Clinton's authorization, appointed lawyer Robert Fisk as special counsel in the Whitewater matter.
Most of the newspapers in the country asked me to have a special counsel appointed. That's what I have done. I did it so that I could go on with my work. I want a full investigation. I want this thing to be done fully, clearly, and to be over with.
Years later, Clinton would say, "It was the worst mistake of my presidency." By the spring of 1994, Bill Clinton had endured 18 months of attacks by his political enemies, the press, and even other Democrats. Tired of playing defense, he set out to reclaim his presidency with one grand gesture.
Clinton understood that very few presidents create their own greatness. Greatness is usually thrust upon them by a crisis. Abe Lincoln had the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt had the Depression and World War II. And so that was a challenge for Clinton. What am I going to do that's going to make me remembered?
For 60 years, this country's tried to reform health care. President Roosevelt tried, President Truman tried, President Nixon tried, President Carter tried. Every time, the special interests were powerful enough to defeat them. But not this time.
Healthcare was to be the giant monument of the Clinton presidency.
Under our plan, every American would receive a health care security card.
Bill Clinton held up this health care card that we were all going to get. Every one of us were going to get this card from the government, certifying that we had health care coverage. And we were all certain that we were absolutely going to get this done.
To lead the signature initiative of his presidency, Clinton turned, as he always did, to the person he trusted most.
This is a crucial moment in the
fight for health care reform in our nation, we all know our country needs health security that's decent, affordable for every American.
There are those who cynically say he owed her for standing by her man despite Jennifer Flowers and all the rest during the campaign. But I think it was something else. Clinton adores her, and he especially adores her mind.
We cannot provide primary and preventive health care in America if we don't make better use of our nurses.
Bill Clinton really believed that if anybody was going to come up with the answer to the most vexing public policy problem out there, it was going to be Hillary. It was one of the stupidest political decisions that Bill Clinton ever made.
And now it's time for everybody to board their buses who's going.
Hillary Clinton took to her new job with all the energy and determination pent up during the previous year.
This is an issue that affects everybody.
In forums and town meetings across the country, she heard stories of insurance abuse, exorbitant health care bills, and poor quality care. But once back in Washington, she shut out nearly every outside voice, relying on a tight circle of advisors to write a 1,300-page plan that would radically reshape the nation's healthcare system.
There was a rigidity and an unwillingness to really listen. The mark of a good politician is to listen and to be able to understand what's really being said. The frailty of Hillary was it was too cloistered, too walled off, and she really thought what she perceived as the public opinion in favor of health care would override the resistance in Congress and of the special interests, and it was a big mistake.
This was covered under our old plan.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one, wasn't it?
By the summer, Hillary's plan was being pilloried by the health insurance industry as a big government takeover of health care.
We spent more than a year trying to legislate something the country didn't want.
Having choices we don't like is no choice at all.
Yeah, they choose.
We lose.
We scared people by saying, the healthcare system isn't working, and here comes the government to fix it. And Ronald Reagan had been schooling this public for many years now that the government is the problem. People didn't think, oh, great, here comes the government. Reagan had won that argument.
Clinton did little to hedge Hillary's all-or-nothing bet, or avert the looming political catastrophe.
In the president's mind, this was something that he had given to Hillary, and he was very, very reluctant to override her. And I think that because of the husband-wife relationship, that it was not something that he was willing to take on.
It inhibited Bill Clinton from following his own independent judgment, his own best instincts of when to compromise. He found it difficult to defy her very powerful wishes. And that's not a position a president wants to be in.
Socialized medicine makes me sick. Socialized medicine makes me sick.
Throughout the summer of 1994, as lawmakers heard from their frightened constituents, Hillary's health care bill lost support. By Labor Day, before it even came up for a vote in Congress, the Clinton health care bill was dead.
The defeat of health care was a huge defeat. It was the #1 objective, and to have it defeated was a repudiation in a sense, or at least felt like a repudiation of the Clinton administration.
By the fall of 1994, the Clinton presidency was at its lowest ebb. Weakened by scandal and the defeat of healthcare, Clinton was about to be challenged by a new and formidable rival.
I am a genuine revolutionary. They are the genuine reactionaries. We are going to change their world. They will do anything to stop us. They will use any
Brimming with self-confidence, Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich had spent more than a decade planning his assault on the Democratic Party.
He was a giant personality. He was one of the best policy wonks and thinkers of new ideas around. But his style was very different from mine. His personality and his approach was, if it's not arrogance, it's at least overconfidence.
You know, Clausewitz said that war is politics by other means. Newt thought the reverse was true, that politics was war by other means.
Gingrich's ultimate goal was nothing less than a dismantling of what he called the liberal welfare state. He would begin by trying to break the Democrats' 40-year stranglehold on the House of Representatives in the upcoming midterm elections.
We had some people that were not satisfied to just passively go along with being in an abused, mistreated minority. And there were a lot of Republicans that had been in the minority for so long, they thought, this is where we belong, and this is okay if they'll just give us a crumb or two. Newt started rocking the boat.
Gingrich decided that the best way to achieve a Republican victory in the midterms was to run against Clinton. Republican candidates across the country morphed their Democratic opponents into the president.
Look at Congressman Tim Johnson's voting record. It looks just like Bill Clinton's liberal agenda.
The plan was to nationalize the election. Newt saw fundamental flaws in the Democratic Party's relationship with the American electorate, and he wanted to develop and exploit those and run a campaign based on that.
As the elections approached, Clinton hit the campaign trail, hoping that his old magic could hold back the Republican tide.
Part of Bill Clinton's persona is an abiding belief that if he can just have enough time, he can win over just about anybody.
Clinton was sure his record could yet win over the American people. By the fall of 1994, the economy was growing again. In September, he added a new ban on assault weapons to his list of accomplishments. But scandals, the failure of health care, and foreign policy missteps weighed heavily on public opinion.
I remember him saying to me on God knows how many speeches, Harold, if I can just communicate to enough Americans what we have done and where we want to take the country, we'll win this.
I now declare the polls open.
One of the big questions of the day is whether the Republicans have been successful in turning this election into a referendum on Bill Clinton as they had wanted.
Our exit polls are turning up bad news all over the country for President Clinton and his party.
I had called a friend at NBC to find out what the 1:30 exit polls looked like. And she told me, well, Tony, I actually haven't seen the 1:30 exit polls. They're holding them back. Apparently, you guys are doing so well that there must be something wrong with the polling. That was the beginning of a hopeful evening that turned into a glorious one.
This is truly a wildly historic night. I mean, this is just, you know.
The Republican revolution of election '94 shook Capitol Hill like an earthquake today. Its reverberations went into state houses and moved the whole political landscape sharply to the right.
By the end of the night, Republicans had picked up 54 seats in the House and 8 in the Senate, winning control of both chambers of Congress.
The longest walk I took in my life was from I was still in the basement in the West Wing over to the second floor of the residence to tell him what he already knew, that we had lost the House and the Senate.
That Christmas was another dismal one. Clinton wandered the corridors of the White House, obsessing about his defeat. The old question haunted him. What did I do wrong?
In politics, you want to be loved. Politics is about wanting to be loved. And suddenly, there's a message that maybe they don't love you. And how do you deal with that? He really went through a lot of, of kind of internal conflicts. But again, typical Bill Clinton, he was angry, he was mad, he was, what went wrong. But at the same time, He was asking himself, how do I fix it?
There was no doubt in my mind that Bill Clinton could come back or would come back. He always came back. Bill Clinton was constitutionally incapable of not coming back. The real question was how? In what form?